Episode 2. Modder. Saturday, July 11, 2037. 9 days before, Paprika had snatched a few hours' sleep, a shower and a change of clothes, but now decisions had to be made. Carlos and Riz followed Paprika into the kitchen. Paprika cracked their knuckles, deep in thought. How could they share what they had made without getting caught? What if Proda had already detected them? Paprika was nervous about what they had done but couldn't let Carlos and Riz see that. They were following Paprika's lead, for once. It felt good. Besides, this was the only plan they had. Paprika reached for the crockpot-sized Vitrovat on the counter, turning it on. A display flickered in the air, glitching like an old TV. Paprika gave the side of the vat a whack. The image stabilized and Paprika scrolled through all the foods they couldn't afford. Expensive-looking breakfast burritos and fruit plates flew by, until Paprika landed on the ramen icon and mashed the button 3 times. Bubbles filled the glass cylinder. Tiny lumps appeared, growing geometrically. They watched as clumps of flour and salt began to clabber together and multiply into noodles, spinning and twisting into knots in the bubbling water. Paprika turned to face the others. "We gotta play it. I mean like, for real, outside, play it." Riz's eyes bulged. "We can't play it," she said, throwing up her hands in protest. "We put any of this on the network and the admins'll see it." Paprika walked over to the window, looking at the street below. "We'll keep it all local. We won't link anything to our wallets, or Broadside accounts, or Luminous IDs. Stay totally anon and offline." Ping! The ramen was ready. Carlos grabbed some plates, nodding in agreement. It seemed to Paprika that Carlos was genuinely unfazed by all this risk. He looked over at Riz. "Hand me the ketchup?" Riz looked at them both in complete disbelief. "Aren't you guys scared?" she said. "What if Proda find out?" "We'll keep it low-key," Paprika said, trying to sound confident. "Just one game. Off-network. Nothing tied to us. A test run. If it's good, we'll take it to Proda and sell it to them as like, DLC, an expansion pack." Paprika drained the vat. Steam rose with a hiss. Riz was thinking hard, but she didn't look convinced. Paprika slopped the ramen onto paper plates, handing them to Carlos one by one. "We'll play somewhere way off the grid," Carlos nodded. "Nowhere a marshal patrol could find us." Paprika nodded at this, doing their best to persuade Riz. Paprika knew they could get in a lot of trouble. It still seemed like a better option than being homeless. But they had to convince Riz to go along with them. "You're really telling me you don't want to play this one time?" Paprika asked her. Riz sighed and looked at the floor. Carlos squeezed ketchup onto the ramen and handed it to her. Riz looked at the rubbery plate of noodles for a second, before she nodded, taking it. "All right," she mumbled. "But just one time. We need to find somewhere hella private." She took a bite of the ramen, chewing on the thought. Who do we know with a big backyard dumb enough to do this? The 3 members of Rug Mob dozed on loungers by the pool in Jason's well-manicured backyard in Marin County. A vast, sun-dappled lawn spread out around the glistening neon blue rectangle in front of them. Jason opened an eye, disturbed by a dancing phone icon trilling. "Why is Paprika calling you?" asked Tacky, peering over his sunglasses at the caller ID. Jason frowned, confused. He hit answer anyway. Paprika's voice wafted into the air. "Can you keep a secret, dickhead?" Ding dong. Jason's doorbell sounded weighty. Paprika, Carlos and Riz looked around, intimidated by the mansion's grandiose front porch. They were wearing brand new, freshly printed bone suits, animal skull helmets in hand. The armor was thicker, stronger, and multicolored. It looked a little rough around the edges in the light of day, but more than made up for it with personality. Jason opened the door. He was wearing his own Rug Mob branded version of the hacked armor, complete with a brand new Rug Mob jaw mask covering his mouth. Paprika felt excited that he had already tinkered with the designs, and relieved. They'd taken a gamble contacting their archrivals and sharing the hacked code with them. Rug Mob could have snitched, but Paprika didn't think it was their style. Rug Mob hadn't reported Skeleton Crew after catching Paprika in the league game. that was some dweeb up in the bleachers. Paprika's hunch was Rug Mob would see the potential of the hack, and from the way Jason, Shiv and Taki played, Paprika knew they were okay with breaking the rules. Well? Paprika asked. How is it? Jason took off the jaw mask. A big grin spread across his face. Start. The two teams charged at each other across the huge lawn. Digital NFT armor and weapons were projected over their physical armor, also modded. They looked less like generic video game space marines, and more like astronauts who had run away and joined the circus. Paprika's new bone suit felt great. It fitted perfectly. Being comfortable in their own skin gave Paprika a new sense of confidence. Paprika clutched a huge, exaggerated assault rifle of their own design, overloaded with scopes, twin grenade launchers and extended clips. It looked like something out of a cartoon. The bone suits were a little harder to operate than regular Broadside gear. The interface had some bugs, and the armor and shock absorbers lagged more than usual. But it didn't matter. They were running faster than regular bone suits allowed, colored speed lines trailing in their wakes. They could jump higher. Explosions were brighter. Everything was bigger. Everything was louder. Paprika covered Carlos as he charged at Jason, spraying him with a torrent of bullets. Jason fired back ripsaw blades. Carlos veered away as the blades tore into his digital armor. He saw a winged pill icon flapping its way through the sky above him. He jumped at the power-up, catching it. His health recovered, and his gun and digital armor grew larger. He landed, unleashing giant bullets that homed in on Jason. Jason's health level plummeted. Oversized rounds smashed into him, destroying panel after panel of digital armor. He slid into cover behind a tree trunk. Carlos strafed around the tree to finish him, savoring the moment. Gee yeah, you just got dangled, boy. Carlos bellowed. Bones up, kid. Come on out. Let's F. Thwack! Shiv ambushed Carlos, swinging a huge burning axe. Carlos's body flew across the lawn. Flames enveloped his digital armor as it shrank down to its normal size. He crash-landed beside a boulder, dropping his gun. He looked up, a sliver of energy keeping him in the game. Now he was caught between a rock and Shiv. Shiv whirled the burning axe overhead, flames whipping the air like helicopter blades. Carlos edged away. He reached out, drawing a red X with his finger on the ground, just in front of Shiv, who looked confused. Whatever this paintbrush app was, it was not a standard feature of Broadside. Shiv roared, swinging the axe faster. Got him? Carlos whispered into his radio. Across the lawn, high in a tree, Paprika crouched, aiming a double-barreled sniper rifle. They couldn't see Shiv yet. Another tree blocked the view, but could see the red X. Got him, Paprika replied. Shiv took the bait, swinging at Carlos, stepping forward onto the marker, bringing the axe down hard. P.A. plow! Shiv's head snapped back as the twin sniper rounds caught them between the eyes. They fell to the ground, yowling in pain. The axe disappeared in a shower of pixels just before it could connect with Carlos. War HE4D Mercs SH1V. Carlos laughed, scrambling to his feet. What the? Who made all these new features? Asked Shiv. We thought you guys did, replied Carlos. I shared the code with some of the other teams. It's no big. Jason replied over the radio. I don't know who added that paint thing to the map, but it's sick, right? Riz caught up to Carlos, hearing Jason on the radio too. Jason, did you just say other teams? Did you put this on a cloud server? Riz asked in disbelief. Jason's voice came back over the radio. Don't worry, crybaby. No one knows who made it. They won't find you or your little hacker friend, Warhead. Riz went red at this. Jason, we told you not to. B.A. Blue Owl. Jason appeared behind Riz, discharging a 3-barreled shotgun point blank into Riz's back. JA50NCHEAPSHOTS Riz. Sue me, Habibi, crowed Jason as he hurdled Riz's falling body. Paprika watched from their vantage point, suddenly going cold inside their bone suit. Jason had shared the code? With who? Carlos distracted Paprika from the thought, as he charged in the opposite direction from Jason, only to run into Tacky. Tacky raised a 4-barreled nail cannon, pointing it at Carlos. Tacky grinned. Carlos shouted into his radio as Tacky bore down on him. Paprika, get over here, we gotta. Blam! 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 Tacky pinned Carlos to the ground, needlessly unloading the whole magazine. He moaned in pain, flinching as the haptics in his bone suit reacted to each digital nail. He looked like a pincushion. Talk 1 nails CARLO5. Jason ran past Carlos and sprang upwards. He vaulted off a tree trunk, reached up and snatched the NFT flag, floating by a branch above. Rug mob have the flag. Paprika saw the words scrolling through the air, jumped down from their vantage point and sprinted through the bushes towards the others. They would find out exactly who Jason had shared the code with. But first, Paprika was going to pwn him once and for all. Jason bailed with the flag. Tacky and Shiv followed, covering him. Paprika and Riz were close behind, blasting. Shiv produced a small cartoon bomb as they ran, complete with crackling fuse. Shiv raised a rippling arm to hurl the bomb, just as Paprika raised the sniper rifle. Blap! War HE4D no scopes SH1V. Too easy. Shiv hit the deck, but just before their digital armor disappeared, Shiv managed to hike the bomb into the air. Paprika dived. Riz froze. Blam! SH1V SPLODESR1Z. Jason and Tacky sped on. Let's finish this, Jason cried. Paprika got back on their feet, racing after Jason. Tacky appeared from behind, wielding a red-hot plasma scythe. What the hell is that? Cried Paprika. Tacky shrugged. Paprika could see Tacky's thick pink eye shadow through his visor. Found it on the server, Tacky said, winking. Paprika's mind was racing just as fast as they were running away from Tacky. If there were NFT weapons they hadn't made being uploaded to servers, it meant other people were modding the code too, minting new NFTs, and maybe not being as careful to cloak their identities and cover their tracks. This was not good. Paprika sped up, pulling away from Tacky, producing a small ballistic throwing star they designed from their weapons inventory. Tacky got closer. Close enough. Tacky raised the scythe, ready to cut Paprika in half. That was when Paprika stopped dead, crouching in a ball on the floor like a hedgehog. Tacky tried to stop, but it was too late. Tacky slammed into Paprika's back, flipping head over heels, dropping the scythe as he rolled through the dirt. Tacky sat up, dizzy. Chalk! The ballistic throwing star buried itself in Tacky's helmet. It began to glow white-hot for a second and... Plume! War HE4D nukes TAK-1. Paprika ran on, snatching the plasma scythe from Tacky. Paprika made a fast break in the other direction to flank Jason, skidding into the undergrowth as they spotted him up ahead. He was carrying the flag towards the Rug Mob base, coming their way. Paprika smiled. It was time to end this kid. Carlos's voice came over the radio. Paprika, keep him busy, we're almost there. He's not getting past me. Paprika pulled a silver square with a QR code on it from their bonesuit pocket, their last custom NFT holotag. Carlos's voice cut over the radio again. Just wait up, for once in your damn. Paprika muted him, creeping forward and tossing the NFT holotag out of the bushes onto the path. A life-size 3D image of Paprika in their default broadside armor appeared, looking in Jason's direction, aiming an assault rifle. It wasn't the perfect plan, the image was of their old armor, but Paprika only needed Jason distracted for a split second. Jason saw it. He charged forward, flag in one hand, firing his gun at the holographic image with the other. Paprika smiled, stormed out of the bushes, and raised the scythe. Its blade glinted, pulsing with heat. Jason skidded to a stop, turned, and looked at the real Paprika. Like he was expecting this. Paprika realized what they'd walked into at the same time as Shiv lunged from the bushes. KRRRONCH. Shiv's lumpy fist sent Paprika into orbit, crash landing at Jason's feet. SH-1V Broadside's War HE-4D. Paprika sat up, winded, processing the humiliation of history repeating itself inside of 24 hours. Jason shook his head. A holotag decoy? What are you? 5. Paprika looked up at him, wheezing, unable to respond once again. Shiv walked over too, laughing, stamping out the NFT tag of Paprika like a cigarette butt. Oldest trick in the book? Ass hat. Down the street, someone else was watching the Broadside game through a sniper's scope. A sharpshot, a robot from the same family as Marshall's, watched from its vantage point at the top of a redwood tree. The robot was thinner and more delicate than a Marshall, but with the same traffic cone colorway. It had a long sniper rifle for an arm. Its single blue eye was as large as a telephoto lens. It focused in on the action. Somewhere else, the sharpshot's footage streamed onto a large screen. The screen was floating in a sleek, spacious office high above the city, the only thing in the room illuminating the woman watching it. Jane Stratton zoomed in on Paprika's head, face still hidden by their animal skull helmet. Jane watched with interest as Paprika picked themselves up and dusted off their armor. Across town in South City, Michelle Weems looked out from the construction elevator as it descended in the paling afternoon sun. The skyline made her feel obsolete. The older buildings, designed by humans, were symmetrical and orderly. The new ones climbing high above them, created by generative algorithms, looked more like plants. They were characterized by permutations rather than patterns. Many of them were moving, slowly oscillating to keep up with the sun, drinking in as much solar energy as possible. They had lumpy, bone-like joints. Not a single line was straight. Everything looked hand-drawn and improvised. And yet Michelle knew they were structurally stronger and more efficient. Michelle was a tall, stoic black woman who looked older than her 20 years. She felt out of place in a hard hat. She had wanted to study architecture when she was younger, before everything went sideways. Not that there was much call for architects these days. People didn't think in a way that allowed them to design like ICE did. She felt lucky to be working on the cranes, to have a job that wasn't completely menial. Michelle felt there wasn't much beyond that left in this world for someone like her to do, except get through another day without using. The elevator reached ground level of the construction site. Michelle yawned and scratched at the scar behind her ear from the upgrade she'd had a few months ago. The jagged ribs of the new skyscraper she was working on towered through the fog at her back. She took off her hard hat as she headed out onto Market Street. Her luminous display came to life. She perused messages and notifications via icons and bubbles blossoming around her as she walked. Opening Luminous after a long night felt like splashing warm water on her face. Streams of news, media and chat cascaded around her like confetti. A headline about the president refusing to sign the Accra Protocol irritated her. She hadn't heard back from her brother Koth on the job opening on the cranes. That was annoying too. She forgot all this a second later, when a notification on a dating app from a girl she'd been DMing popped up. Endorphins bathed her brain. Impulses were triggered. Emotions spiked and dipped. It felt like a hit. Michelle knew better. Even little hits of media were risky when she was tired. Metaverse addiction was a common problem, one Michelle had succumbed to at a young age. But thanks to VRA and a daily dose of medication, she had been away from the hard stuff for almost 4 years, one day at a time. It was when she closed her feed that she saw the marshals getting out of a riot wagon up ahead. She tensed but kept walking. Whatever was happening, it wasn't about her, she told herself. She was just a crane operator finishing her shift. Running from marshals wasn't part of her day anymore. But getting stopped never ended well for her. She was clean now, but her rap sheet remained colorful. It was time to go. Michelle walked over to the PRT stop, where she was meeting Camilla, just fast enough to not look suspicious. Personal rapid transit pods ran through the city on the old tram lines. They looked like drug capsules on wheels. Michelle kept a low profile, waiting for the next PRT pod to arrive. She heard the faint whir of an electric motor approaching and turned, expecting to see a pod approaching. Before she could react, the whir grew into something else. the familiar and frightening whine of high-powered rotor blades. "This is a routine security check. Please stay where you are," the Panop drone boomed from above, causing Michelle to jump. She looked up as the Panop began scanning her and the rest of the people around her on the street, its rotors blowing dust and trash around them. "To ensure your family's safety, only use approved Proto products and software," the panel barked, in the same voice as its two-legged Marshall cousins. "Any unauthorized downloading, printing, minting or growing can result in fines or imprisonment." Like a Marshall, Panops also had red and white armor plating. They had hunched backs and clusters of blue bug eyes looking in every direction. They came equipped with twin adze heat cannons. An old white guy started shouting something at the drone about his rights. "Stay where you are," the Panop ordered again. The marshals up ahead had noticed. They fanned out, marching towards them. The old white guy kept shouting. Michelle stared daggers in his direction. She wanted to tell him to shut up but knew better than to shout at anyone when a Panop was circling. The old man was pointing now too. The drone hovered lower, moving towards him. Michelle's heart drummed in her chest. "She couldn't be here." "Michelle?" said a familiar voice. Michelle spun around to see Camilla, her VRA sponsor. Camilla was a petite Mexican woman in her 50s, sweet and strong, with bright, kind eyes. She had a lot of time clean, and it showed. Although right at this moment, Camilla looked as confused as everyone else on the street about what was happening. A PRT pod whined as it pulled up to the stop. A young couple emerged. They looked up from their feeds too, startled by the drone, and the old man, who had now picked up a rock from the gutter. Michelle panicked. She grabbed Camilla by the arm and darted into the glass pod. The Panop instantly turned on her. "Stay where you are," it screamed. "What are you doing?" shouted Camilla. Michelle wanted to explain. She knew this was a terrible idea, but her brain was in flight mode. She wasn't getting arrested or shot again. She set the destination for South City. Just as she did, the old guy launched the rock he was holding at the Panop. The drone twisted in the air as the rock dinged its hunched body, instantly locking on the old guy and firing. The man's shouting became screaming as ripples of heat pounded him into the ground. Michelle knew this was her only chance. She hit go, and the PRT pulled away. Michelle and Camilla looked back as the pod lurched forward. People shrieked and ran. The marshal platoon moved in on the crumpled, unconscious body of the old man. "What the hell was that?" asked Camilla as they pulled out of the city, gaining speed as the pod headed towards the 101 freeway. "I'm sorry started Michelle, catching her breath, wiping the sweat beading on her forehead. "I just freaked out, Camilla. I've been caught up in the wrong situation like that too many times." Camilla leaned forward and put a hand on her. "That's not you anymore, Mommy. You didn't do anything wrong. You're clean," she smiled. "You don't run like that." "Bad idea." Michelle shook her head and looked out the window, biting her lip. She knew Camilla meant well, but being a young black woman was not the same as being an older Mexican woman in 2037 San Francisco, and she did not have the energy to get into all that right now. Through the windows, she noticed another flock of Panops hovering over the freeway traffic as they sped away from downtown, towards South City. "It doesn't matter that I'm clean," Michelle answered. "You know how those algorithms are." "You're right," Camilla conceded, like she was talking to a 7-year-old. "Security algorithms do treat the average black or brown person worse than the average white person. But we ain't average, Michelle, we're addicts. And I'm an addict with a record twice as long as yours. Those things see that the moment they lock eyes on us. So, we can't just run. Not anymore. Everything that happens now, we must stand and face honestly. We must do the right thing and trust that we'll be okay. That's what recovery is about." Michelle took this in. If they had come after us. "I don't even want to think about what would have happened," Camilla continued. A scowl flashed across her face. "Don't you ever put me in a situation like that again, you hear?" Michelle nodded. She didn't like this. Camilla was rarely mad at her. Michelle had met Camilla when she washed up at VRA, sent there by a court order when she was 15, after a week-long binge landed her in the hospital. Sure, she got a tone-deaf lecture every now and then. But she loved Camilla. She'd be dead by now if it wasn't for her. I haven't seen you all scared and jittery like this in a while, said Camilla, her face softening again. Reminds me of how you were when you came in. Camilla probably had a better memory of that time in Michelle's life than she did. Michelle remembered weighing nothing from the suppressants. But aside from that, her teens were a blur of bad VR trips, worse drugs, and a bag of dangerous situations she got into to feed her habit. Camilla was searching her face. What's wrong, honey? What's going on? Outside, the silhouette of South City came into view as the PRT snaked down the 101 freeway. The sun was sinking behind the mountains. Michelle thought there seemed to be more riot wagons amongst the city traffic than usual. I don't know, it's just. Some days I don't know what the point is. You know? Michelle answered. I go to my job. I'm almost the only human there. I worry about Koth. I try to help him, but all he wants to do is play Broadside and run around making money in sketchy ways, so we argue. And then I wake up and do it all over. I thought life would be bigger than this somehow. I just want things to change. She thought on this for a second and shrugged. Maybe that's why I ran. I used to run from everything, said Camilla. I was allergic to real life, so I checked out. Going deep let me forget who I was, how I felt, and the hard truths I didn't want to face. Running was easy. Destroying it all was easy. Facing what's in front of me. Really dealing with it? That's some hard work. Michelle nodded. There were a lot of people in VRA with all kinds of metaverse addictions, but Camilla and Michelle had been hooked on the most destructive stuff. Going deep, they called it. By hooking into full immersion VR software in Luminous and ingesting a cocktail of brain stimulants and appetite suppressants, you could live in a virtual fantasy of your choosing for almost as long as you wanted, or more precisely, for as long as could afford. Going deep had taken a toll on Michelle at a young age. She'd woken up in the emergency room almost as many times as she had in the cells at Tenderloin Police Station. I'm trying, Michelle said. I'm grateful. Life is better now, you know? But when I get in a situation like that, it's like, I snap back to the old me. I'm lucky Koth doesn't remember the way I was. He's lucky to have you, said Camilla, giving her a squeeze. The way you've raised him. And you're damn lucky that old guy was such a good shot with that rock. They smiled at each other. Michelle felt better. Her pulse wasn't racing anymore. The danger was behind them. Home was up ahead. The pod turned off at the exit and headed into the South City slums, snaking past the giant white letters on Sign Hill that read, South San Francisco. The Industrial City. The sign was a Bay Area landmark, which had stood above the South City since the 1920s. Now the sign hung in the shadows, dwarfed by what South City had mutated into. Reaching high into the sky surrounding the hill was a series of grimy, haphazard towers. The evolution of the last 30 years of DIY building design was all there to see, one layer of slum 3D printed on top of another. They were self-replicating barrios, reaching towards the heavens like giant anthills. These citadels were, by and large, residential. Washing lines and flags hung from balconies. Precarious walkways connected the towers at different levels. Drones and neon adverts hung around them like flies. If the AI-designed buildings downtown were exotic plants, the slum towers were weeds. We're late, Camilla said, glancing at the time. Michelle eyed a printer crane teetering on the side of a tower, busy tacking on new units. It squeezed molten ceramic lines from its nozzle like toothpaste, joining the lines together into geometric shapes. Look at this mess, she tutted. You see how dangerous that is? People out here working with no training, definitely no insurance. So maybe go help them, said Camilla. Be of service. Maybe that'd help your life feel bigger? The PRT slowed, crawling into the Sign Hill neighborhood. Michelle shook her head. I can't get caught building anything without a permit down here. She trailed off when she saw two marshals waiting for them. Stay calm, ordered Camilla. But she looked scared too. Michelle's pulse was a jackhammer. She climbed out into the bustling street. The air hung thick and hot. She held her breath. The marshals eyed them as they passed but said nothing. Michelle breathed out. Camilla squeezed her hand again as they crossed the street. Calmate, calmate. Trust your higher power. They're not here for you. Let's go. Camilla waved to some other members of VRA filing into the building ahead of them where the meeting was, an abandoned shopping mall that served as a makeshift community center. Michelle looked around. The street was dotted with marshal patrols and pan-ups as far down as she could see, scanning and searching through the crowds. They never usually came this far into the slums. She turned back to Camilla. Then what are they looking for? On the other side of South City, Michelle's brother Koth was suiting up at the warehouse space where his team usually played. His back ached, fresh off his shift at the Bubble Kitchen. He pulled his bone suit on over his work t-shirt, annoyed that Omar and the others weren't there yet. The game started in 10 minutes. He messaged Omar, "Where you at B?" He saw 3 flashing dots in the corner of his eye that indicated Omar was writing back. Then a phone icon flashed. Omar was calling. "Yo, you didn't hear?" "Hear what?" said Koth. "We got a game. Why is no one here?" "Man, forget the regular ass game. Come over to Hillside Park." "What? Omar, this is a league game?" "Bro, forget the league. Everyone is here. Look, we're not supposed to talk about it online, just come to the park." "You gotta see this." Koth sighed, hung up and grabbed his bag. Paprika, Riz and Carlos cooled off on Jason's patio by the pool. The late afternoon sun was wearing thin. They sat helmets off, swigging waters as they watched 2 other teams play on the sprawling lawn. The backyard was full of young Broadsiders, who kept arriving as word continued to spread. Jason swaggered over. "You know, that's 2 days in a row we dragged nuts all over you guys," he said with a big grin. They all ignored him, continuing to watch the game. Jason looked over at the game too. "Whatever," he continued, "but this little game we cooked up is pretty freaking fuego, right?" Paprika felt their blood get hot, hating it when others tried to take credit for things they did. What did you do?" Paprika frowned at Jason. "Other than tell the whole world about it? First off, I gave your broke ass a place to play it," Jason shot back. "You know how much trouble I could get in for this? And anyway, in case you hadn't noticed, the whole world is making Broadside even better." Paprika swigged their water and looked away, shaking their head. Jason snorted and walked away. Riz pulled up the Anon wallet Paprika had set up. It was all encrypted, bouncing through several different exchanges, all DEXs, of course, and wallets, with pseudonyms, fake IDs and VPNs deployed at every turn. There was no way anyone could trace them. Paprika looked at it wide-eyed. It was overflowing with ETH like it had just hit the jackpot, as both donations from grateful Broadsiders and secondary revenue from NFT weapons and armor sales poured in. The trio exchanged excited glances. There was enough here to pay the Broadside League fine, cover the rent, and then some. Paprika's smile faded as they looked across the lawn. There were teams here now all in different permutations of armor, sharing the hacked game, making improvements, minting, printing, and selling their own NFTs and passing the code on for free. The more people shared it for free, the more money was pouring in. "So many people know," Paprika said. "It hasn't even been a day." Carlos looked around too. "Don't worry," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "It's a game. We just created a whole new economy for them. This is the best Broadside expansion pack they ever had. You should get best Oscar for DLC. Proto won't send the cavalry over this. They're coming with the checkbook, fam. Trust." Riz nodded too, putting a hand on Paprika's. "It'll be fine," she said. Paprika looked at their hand touching Riz's, then up into her big brown eyes, smiling back at her with a nod. Riz looked at Carlos, who was looking at them both, unamused. Riz moved her hand and looked the other way. Episode 3. Maker. Sunday, July 12, 2037. 8 days before, Sam Kaur sat meditating on the boardroom table at the top of the Proto pyramid. He didn't have his own office. That would send the wrong message about the kind of CEO he was. He opened his eyes slowly, breathing out deeply. He was at peace. He felt safe. In fact, In this moment, security was something he felt viscerally. He felt in control of all he could see. The skyline glistened below. Cars, trains and PRT pods shunted into the city across the Bay Bridge, moving together like swarms of ants. Traffic crawled through checkpoints. Panops hovered, watching it all, relaying everything of interest back to Proda. As usual, he was wearing a t-shirt and yoga pants, with prayer beads on his wrist. Looking humble was important. At 25, he was the world's youngest trillionaire, something he wasn't entirely comfortable with. He never wanted to appear vulgar or flashy. But from this vantage point, he was all-seeing and all-knowing. To Sam, this was true wealth. This was true power. He breathed in again, with purpose, as he brought his attention back to the room. A giant orchid stood in the center of the piano-black boardroom table with its head bowed. The table and chairs hovered in a magnetic field. They had no legs to speak of. Glass doors led out to a covered patio dotted with bonsai trees. Just beyond that, a helipad. A security detail of marshals and sharps shots were present. They remained hidden, but Sam knew they were there. On the opposite side of the boardroom, a second set of doors led to a bank of elevators. Everything was as it should be. He reactivated Luminous. Screens and notifications appeared, glowing above the table in front of him as he stretched his legs. All the stats he cared about were pointing up and to the right. He was reminded of the back seat of his parents' car, one of his favorite places to be as a child. He would sit staring out of the window for hours, as they snaked up the 101 from their home in Palo Alto to see his grandparents in Sonoma. It was sacred time, one of the rare moments his overachieving parents weren't micromanaging him. He had access to all the apps and content he cared about on his trusty tablet. The world outside rolled by, framed and manageable beyond the windows. The airbag logos on the door pillars reassured him that protection hid coiled inside the car's body, ready to spring out and defend him as needed. It was that feeling, of complete security and control, that he had been chasing ever since. His therapist Jenny had been so pleased when he'd made this observation. She declared any time he connected his feelings back to early childhood, a breakthrough. He didn't put a lot of stock in their sessions, or his inner child, but they had helped him stop taking the pills. There was no denying that. He felt calmer. It occurred to him in that moment, despite all that had happened, all the opposition to his taking over this company, all the sacrifices he had made, he'd done it. He had made the world a better, more secure place. A melodic tone broke the silence as politely as it could, letting Sam know his assistant needed to speak with him. "Sir, I have the president for you?" "Sure," he said as he sat up, stretching, his screens fading. In their place, the torso of a middle-aged Mexican-American man appeared, floating above the table. Mike Reyes was the President of the United States. He grinned at Sam like a game show host. "Hey Sam, great seeing you last week." Sam bowed, putting his hands together. "Humbled as always, Mr. President. I hope you don't mind me calling like this." "I know you're busy," said the president, his smile fading. "Sam, the UN conference on renewables is coming up. You said you'd think more on it, CRA. You've seen the latest polls. We gotta revisit this." Sam nodded thoughtfully at this, thinking on it. Bringing his hands, still in prayer, up to his mouth. "I hear you, Mike. You're right, we do," he said firmly. "I know you're under immense pressure. We're going to make this happen. My only concern at present is the timing." Sam looked up at the president, shaking his head with regret. "Sam, we knew this wouldn't be easy," the president said, "but I promised we'd get this done in my first term." He trailed off, losing his confidence. Sam smiled at him with sympathy. Sam made sure his body language communicated that he understood the president's position. That he was listening. That he was empathetic. And he was, in part. The headlines on Accra all sounded great. Free energy, free basic material goods and free foodstuffs for every human on Earth, all enabled by Proda-patented technologies. What's not to like? Sam believed the politicians who came up with it were well-meaning and sincere. But he knew this was a reductionist view, and that Accra would not be a workable alternative to the system he had built. He'd meditated on this deeply. He understood his own personal and philosophical objections to this and had tried to put those to one side. But even with all of that stripped away, getting back to first principles, he knew in his heart of hearts that what the Accra Protocol proposed would simply not work in the United States. Proto excelled because it was one seamless closed-loop system, and the company was in complete control. Ripping that apart and replacing it with an open alternative that would essentially be controlled by the UN, not to mention other fragmented, transient, and unreliable government bodies around the world, was a bad idea. Sam would not say this in polite company, but he believed this idea was perhaps the most dangerous threat facing the United States, which, thanks to his efforts, was one of the only nations on Earth that hadn't ratified the Accra Protocol. "You've seen our projections," Sam continued, sounding helpless. "The way this would disrupt supply chains to do this right now, our expansion plans, Mike, this would put millions of Americans out of work." Sam looked at the president, filled with regret. "Sam, we had an agreement. When we spoke, before the campaign." I know," Sam nodded profusely. Then he smiled. "I loved your slogan, Mike. I'll grow a chicken in every pot and print a car in every garage." What a great line. I've never been so excited to back a candidate as I was when I heard you say that for the first time. Where was that again? Ohio? It was Ohio, said the president, smiling back. Sam nodded, grinning. "We're going to keep that promise, Mike. We're going to deliver on what we said we would do. I'm working on it." "I am. I just need a little more time." The president gritted his teeth into an uncomfortable smile, clearly not wanting to push this much more. Sam smiled. He let the uncomfortable silence linger a second longer, and then waved it away. "Look, Mike, I'm your guy. We're going to get this done." The president sighed and nodded. "Sam. It's just..." Sam's PA patched into the room for a second time. "So sorry to interrupt, sir. Jane Stratton is at my desk. She says it's beyond urgent." "Mike, I'm so sorry. Fine. Molly, send her in." Sam turned back to the president. "Mike, I apologize. I can't believe I'm saying this to the leader of the free world," he said with a nervous chuckle. "I need to jump. But I hear you. It's just... not just yet. Stand firm, okay? We'll talk soon." The boardroom doors opened as Jane hurried in. Sam turned to her with a smile as the president's torso vanished behind him. "Shoulda given the other guy the job," Sam said, half joking. Jane looked pale. She wasn't laughing. "What's up?" Sam frowned. Moments later, Sam caught his reflection in the boardroom table. Now he looked pale too. He felt faint, overwhelmed with fear. He stood with Jane, watching Broadside footage on a collage of screens above the table. Legally, Broadside was only to be played in authorized, licensed spaces. Yet the screens showed games in backyards, dirt patches, parking lots, all over the city, happening live. Sam breathed deeply, trying to find his center. Worst-case scenarios flashed through his mind. The stock plummeting, margins eroding, the Proto token tanking. The president signing Accra. How long? "We think only a few hours, a day or so at most," Jane replied, her face tight. "Security teams are scouring every neighborhood. We've upped random stop and searches, but the code is spreading fast. Hey Molly, could you ask Mr. Rook to come up here?" "At once, please," Sam said into luminous. He paced the room slowly, running his fingers through his hair. "Who did this?" he asked. Jane shook her head. "The first game we detected was in Marin. It's already spread to the city, Oakland, South City. Some files were labeled War HE4D, she offered. We don't know what it means, or who that is, but it's our strongest lead so far." The boardroom doors opened as a broad-shouldered man in black clothing strode in. Rook was Sam's personal head of security and special projects. His head was shaved the same length as his stubble. He looked rough, but in an intentional way, like he meant to. He wore military-grade armor plating across his chest, like Broadside armor, only tougher. Thicker. Rook. You remember Jane Stratton, head of our games division, said Sam. Jane nodded. Rook looked her up and down and turned back to Sam. What's the problem? Rook asked in a thick London accent. Sam noticed as Jane's eyes darted between Rook and Sam. She was not used to being ignored. She answered before Sam could. Broadside has been hacked, but I don't think. She paused, looking at Rook. Sam, is this serious enough to bring in our security division at this level? No offense, Mr. Rook. Rook glowered at her. Sam smiled and nodded. This is simply a precaution at this stage, Jane. He said reassuringly. I'm sure it's just kids, and it'll be fine. But this is also the first time someone has hacked anything of ours in years. If they can hack this, it's possible that they can hack anything that can be printed. I mean, when you think about it, this is the most significant security breach Proda has had since. He trailed off, not wanting to dredge up company history. The massacre of A29 had been an albatross around his neck ever since he'd taken over Proda. Even though he had only been 18 when it happened, he'd just started his first company then, taking the CEO job at Proda when he was 21. It was never something he would have let happen. Sam identified as a pacifist. It was his idea to switch the marshals to non-lethal ads rays when he took over Proda. Yet the deaths of those 54 protesters in 2029 tainted everything he tried to do. Nov DeVet, his mentor, and the chairman of the Proda board, had warned him it would be like this. The Proda takeover had made Sam a trillionaire, but it came with baggage. He had to be careful about who he trusted, and what he said. Sam looked at Jane, trying to read her. She looked back at him, standing by her statement. Finally, he forced a smile. Could you give us the room for a sec, Jane? Is that cool? Jane looked taken aback at being asked to leave. She cracked an unconvincing smile, nodded, and turned towards the doors. Rook grinned as she walked away. No offense, love, he said with a wink. Jane sat on the corner of her desk, looking out of the window several floors and pay grades down from Sam's. Feeds of illegal Broadside games streamed across the wall behind her. She looked out at the city, worried. She hadn't seen this side of Sam before. Neon, her assistant, gave a timid knock on the door. Any more leads? Jane asked as she turned. Neon shrugged and shook his head. All we know is that WarHE4D was a temporary gamer tag, only used once or twice. It's not actually linked to a real user ID. Whoever made this hack is freaking paranoid. And freaking good. Have you actually played this thing? He asked, excitement rising in his voice. Jane shot him a look. Of course, you haven't, it's just. People are saying it's pretty cool. Neon tapped the doorframe and disappeared back to his desk. Jane turned her attention back to the view, thinking on this. As much as she wanted to contain the hack, she realized that part of her was jealous of these kids. It felt exciting. It reminded her how she felt when she joined Proda. She always liked it there in the gaming division but held her nose and tolerated everything else the company did. When Sam joined as CEO, at first, she really thought they could change things. Then somewhere along the way, things changed. It used to feel like they would reshape Proda, but most of their time had been spent defending their market position. Tightening their grip on consumers with restrictions and limitations, instead of enticing them with new product innovations. Owning Broadside was strategically important to Sam because it made the company appear tough and conveyed security, but in a way that was fun and in touch with the people. It was a distraction, bread and circuses. A branding exercise. Just another effort to stave off Sam's greatest fear. That one day, his castle would fall. Suddenly the room began to rumble. The desk started to shake. Jane steadied herself, bending her knees. Out in the office people were diving under their desks. Jane stayed where she was. She'd lived in the Bay long enough to know this wasn't an earthquake. Whatever it was coming from above. She got up and marched out of her office. The rumbling reached a deafening level as the elevator doors opened. Jane covered her ears as she emerged, looking around for an explanation. She stepped in front of a team of marshals stomping past her and held out a raised hand. They stopped. What's going on? She yelled over the din. Jane was on a floor higher up than her own, but below the apex of the pyramid. It looked like an airplane hangar, with an entire wall opening out onto a large helipad. An aircraft known as a dogjet hovered a few feet off the floor. Usually, they were Proto red and white, and they did not land at corporate HQ, but this one very much there. It was painted gunmetal gray. It looked like a tubby F-16, crossbred with a quadcopter drone. Its nose was sharp, fierce, and aerodynamic. Its wings short and stubby. 4 rotors spread out from its body, supporting its stout fuselage, which was large enough to carry the squadron of unusual robots marching towards it. The robots were 7, featuring tall and pitch black. Jane hadn't seen these before, at least not in person. She wasn't privy to much that came out of the security division. It was the most secretive of Proto's business verticals, in a company that was hyper-compartmentalized. She had seen a sketch of robots like these in an exec briefing a while back. She recalled these new models were for operations deemed too sensitive for marshals. The product manager in the meeting had referred to them as stealths. She looked up at the enormous warriors as they passed. Each had 4 cold blue eyes. As the stealths approached the dogjet, cloaking activated. They became moving shadows. Jane heard a familiar voice coming from the stealth at the back of the formation. Primary target is an unidentified person known only as Warhead, it barked. It was shorter than the rest at 6 feet, and had a single, oval, piece of blue mirrored glass where its face should be. Secondary targets are any and all other Broadside players using hacked gear and code. My team will take the house in Marin. Hey! Jane boomed at Robot. What is going on? It stopped and looked at Jane, raising its visor. Rook glared out, seething, an angry vein pulsing on the side of his head. What are you doing here? This whole level is classified. Rook motioned to 2 marshals standing guard. They began to walk towards Jane. Suddenly they stopped where they were as Sam stepped out from the elevator bank. It's okay, Rook, said Sam, waving him away. Go? Rook looked at him, then back at Jane. His visor snapped shut over his face as he moved out with the stealths. Rook's cloaking activated as he and the stealths disappeared. The only trace of them was a faint rippling as they climbed into the dogjet's hull. The doors closed. The rotors began to spin. Jane turned and looked at Sam, aghast. Sam held out his hands, as if to plead with her. Jane, this is a precautionary measure. We don't know who we're dealing with. We don't know the hackers behind this are kids. We must be seen to be taking this seriously. We need to send a message. All the stuff with the Accra protocol right now. This is very sensitive. The dogjet's rotors rumbled in chorus, loud and low. Sam, Jane shouted over the din, this is crazy. You can't. Sam put a hand on her shoulder, motioning as though he couldn't hear her. The helipad shook as the dogjet took off. Sam gripped Jane's shoulder and nodded solemnly. She looked up at the aircraft, frustrated and helpless. The dogjet's rotors whipped as the thrusters screamed. Air blasted through its control valves, creating a typhoon on the helipad. Jane and Sam crouched with the landing crew as the dogjet rose before it too cloaked and disappeared. Paprika couldn't believe how quickly life had changed. Last week, they didn't have enough money for ammo. Now the rent was covered, and they were driving down Geary Street in a freshly printed red drop-top roadster. The rims, the trim, everything was custom, all the way down to the vanity plate that read NGMI. Paprika had never considered the possibility of owning a vehicle. Only rich people did this. But it seemed like a good way to spend some of the endless stream of ETH coming in from NFT sales and tips. Paprika slurped a strawberry milkshake as the shiny red car chauffeured them out towards the bridge. Carlos was riding shotgun, eating a burger. Riz was in the back doing the same. They were rested, fed, and heading back to Marin County, ready for more Broadside. 3D bass billowed out from the speakers in waves, blurring the air around the car. No one had come to stop them. Proto hadn't been in touch. They had gotten away with it. All they had to do was keep any modded gear away from checkpoints and official Broadside arenas, and they were good. Life was good. The roadster rolled to a stop at the light close to a Broadside warehouse, music venue and street cafe known as the Rave Bunker. It was packed with teenagers, many of them in Broadside gear and CC0 clothing. Everyone turned and looked as the loud, flashy car pulled up. Carlos rolled down the window and grinned high at a girl outside the cafe, flashing heart-shaped eyes at him through Luminous. As he did so, an info bubble containing his profile opened in the air, bobbing on the rippling tides of 3D bass. The girl looked intrigued, scrolling through the GIFs and images on Carlos's profile. A bubble of info opened above her too. The girl's bubble and Carlos's did a little dance as they connected. Another girl looked at Paprika. Paprika smiled, flattered, and looked away, suddenly feeling nervous again about all this attention. A guy at the cafe was checking out Riz. He started to walk towards the car, opening his bubble, making heart eyes too. Paprika glared. The traffic light changed. Paprika switched the car's interface to manual drive via Luminous, and mashed the accelerate button as hard as they could. The bunker became a blur. It was all Riz and Carlos could do to hold onto their burgers. Carlos stared at Paprika. What was that? We were about to. Oh, my bad, Paprika apologized innocently. I thought you guys were done. Paprika caught Riz's eye in the mirror and looked away. Carlos looked at them both, confused, then back at the girl by the cafe, fast becoming a dot on the horizon. Whatevs, he shrugged. I don't think getting girls is gonna be a problem this summer, he said. I really feel like this is just the beginning of something, you know? Paprika noticed a large, blacked-out SUV behind them. They frowned but decided not to mention it to the others. Paprika didn't want to seem paranoid. That was Riz's job. I know, right? Said Paprika, eyes locked on the SUV. I think we can turn this into a career maybe? The SUV sped up. Getting closer. Proto will find us, sooner or later, said Riz. Yeah, maybe. Carlos shrugged. But they won't stop us. Not now. It'd piss too many people off at this point. Maybe it's time we try and work out a deal with them? The SUV was now right behind them. Paprika opened their mouth to say something, but Carlos interrupted. Hell, they'll probably want to hire us, he said. We won't even have to finish school. Paprika jumped as the SUV charged straight towards them. It swerved, tires squealing as it rode up on the curb, overtaking them. It pulled in front of them and skidded to a stop, power sliding through 90 degrees and barricading the road. Paprika panicked. Their seatbelts tightened, as if grabbing them, pinning them into the seat. The car's emergency braking system locked the wheels up, throwing them sideways as it jolted to a stop. The roadster's gull-wing doors opened upwards with a low whine. Paprika, Riz and Carlos stumbled out in a daze, looking at the SUV. The street was quiet except for them. A pan-up drone was descending from above, orange lights flashing, assessing the scene. Hey, you even see us? Carlos shouted at the black windows. Oh God, shuddered Riz. It's Proto, it's gotta be. We're so done. Paprika enabled Luminous, trying to get a read on the SUV. But the system wasn't responding. Icons flickered in their vision, caught in some kind of static, before Luminous cut out altogether. The SUV window opened a crack. A jagged metal device that resembled a hedge trimmer pushed itself through the gap and aimed at the pan-up. It traced the movements of the drone. The pan-up wobbled, and then struggled, before finally its power died. It crashed to the ground, orange lights splintering as it hit the asphalt. What the hell? Said Paprika. The SUV doors opened. A man in his 40s climbed out. His boots crunched on pieces of the downed pan-up as he approached them. That's the crazy guy from the news, right? Whispered Carlos. Paprika nodded, recognizing him too. Multicolored dreadlocks hung from his fluorescent camo hoodie, which looked like it was designed for hiding at a rave. His dreads swaying from side to side as he approached. His skin was dark and his face round. His thick spectacles should have made him look bookish, but he had the demeanor of an old soldier. It looked like he hadn't changed his combat pants and threadbare t-shirt in a decade or so. Under the hoodie, on his shirt, was a picture of an open hand with an eye in its palm. He stopped in front of them, staring at them like he was at war, and always had been. "Which one of you is Warhead?" he barked. He had a thick, croaky accent Paprika couldn't place. Paprika, Carlos and Riz looked at each other. The back window of the SUV rolled down. Paprika saw the silhouettes of a passenger brandishing the drone jammer and a driver. They were both in hoods too, faces hidden, bandaged in filthy rags. Paprika looked back at the man in front of them. Never heard of him. The man walked right up to Paprika, who took a step back as he approached. "We don't have time for this," he said, raising his voice. "If you have anything to do with those games they're playing in the parks, you need to come with us now." Paprika and Riz remained poker-faced. "They're playing it in the parks?" Carlos said with surprise. "But we told them not to play in pub." "Shut up, Carlos," Paprika said through the side of their mouth, not looking at their brother. The man nodded at Carlos. Riz stepped forward. "Look," she said, "we didn't do anything wrong." The man finished the sentence for her. "You got something right we've been trying to figure out for years." Riz stared at him, confused. "Are you from Proda?" The man shook his head, laughing at the very thought. Paprika opened Luminous again, trying to get a read on the dreadlocked man. It was a scrambled mess of hashes and gibberish. His face pixelated when they tried to examine it using any of the digital tools in Luminous. Riz noticed the pixel camo pattern on his hoodie. Her eyes widened in recognition. "Jesus, is that a D-tag hoodie?" she asked. "Those things are so illegal. You're from one of those protest groups, right?" The dreadlocked man moved his head side to side like this was half true. "I don't believe in power structures. I find it better to organize without organizations," he said with conviction. Carlos looked confused. The dreadlocked man searched the three friends' faces, trying to figure out who he should be talking to. "Do you understand what you did?" he said. "This is the missing piece." "Missing piece of what?" Paprika asked, starting to feel more frustrated than frightened. Was this guy a threat? Were the others in the SUV armed? A security team would be on their way to the downed Panopdrone any second. Paprika realized they had to leave. They turned. The dreadlocked man stepped in front of Paprika. "The code you used to unlock Broadside. It could unlock the security software on everything," he explained. "Which would mean you could copy, mint and print anything." "What?" Paprika asked, not wanting to believe he'd said what they thought he'd said. "Whatever you did to get you into Broadside could get you into the admin panel of any 3D printer in the world," the man continued. "All you need to do is modify it and you'll be able to print solar panels, weapons, whatever you want. Without paying, without anyone knowing who you are. I need you to show me how you did it." Paprika took a step back, dumbstruck. The dreadlocked man took another step forward. "Don't you get it?" he asked. "You opened Pandora's box. This is the beginning of the end. We can feed people, power homes, lift America out of poverty. This will reignite the fight against Proda." He raised a fist as he spat the words out with excitement. I don't believe," stammered Paprika. "Believe," he said. Paprika scanned him for a second, and then started to laugh nervously, backing away, toward the car. "Where are you going?" the man asked, looking confused. "No thanks," Paprika brushed him off like he was a street peddler. "Good luck with the revolution, comrade." Paprika held up a fist in mock solidarity, trying to hide the panic they were feeling. They had to leave this instant. If this man was right about the hack, then Proda would come after them with full force. The dreadlocked man glared at Paprika and stepped forward again. "I need that code," he shouted, his accent thickening with anger, his head shaking so hard his hood fell. "This is the answer. Don't you see? You can break this whole world wide open and make a better one. You! Right now? Today!" The roadster's doors opened again as Paprika approached. Carlos and Riz stepped forward, standing in front of the dreadlocked man like bouncers as Paprika climbed in. "We hacked a game, all right?" Paprika said, looking at the man from the car. "Whatever this is, whatever you're doing. We ain't about it. We don't want any trouble, okay? Trouble? The dreadlocked man repeated with a crazed laugh. We're all in trouble. We live in a false utopia based on lies. Don't you see? You think one company should control this much? You think that's what Web3 was supposed to be about? You think that's the idea this country was founded on? Carlos stepped in front of the man, getting in his face. We're selling the code to Proda, he said, looking at him evenly. Ain't no one else getting it. Don't come looking for us again. You got that, old man? The dreadlocked man laughed and nodded, stepping back, hands raised in peace. Right. 'Cause that's just how this is going to go down. He nodded sarcastically as Carlos and Riz climbed into the roadster. You guys are real smart, you know that? He looked at Paprika again and composed himself. Look, we're not here to cause problems for you. I'm not going to tell you what to do. But if you need anything. Suddenly Paprika's luminous came back to life. They had a new message from the dreadlocked man, invited them to connect with him on something called Sent, an encrypted, decentralized chat app. It said that his name was Zero MC. Paprika studied Zero a second longer. Above, they spotted two more panops in the sky heading towards them. Paprika hit accelerate, and the roadster screamed away. The sun shone down on Jason's patio in Marin. Skeleton Crew and Rug Mob stood together, suited up and helmets on. Two other teams crouched on opposite sides of the lawn, about to start a game. Digital power-ups, weapons and armor scattered the lush green battlefield. Paprika didn't feel like playing. They wanted to tell everyone to stop, but there were so many people, and that was just here. They didn't even know how many other games were happening across the city. Paprika looked at Riz. She looked nervous too. The dreadlocked man had shaken them all up. Sure, Paprika agreed with him in principle. Nobody liked Proda. Maybe the US should sign a CRA. Life would probably be better if everyone had access to basic foods, goods, and services for the cost of printing them. Mom always said there was more innovation in other countries because people didn't have to worry about the basics. More people could make stuff and own it. There were more entrepreneurs and economic activity and whatnot. Mom said that here, everyone was basically sharecropping on Proda's land. But Mom had left in 29, and Paprika had no idea where she was. Dad had been lost in metaverse addiction and ever since. So, screw Mom and her pretentious ideals. Why should Paprika care about politics? It was all hype. What good had it done their family? The most important thing Paprika could do right now was to find the right way to approach Proda, make a deal and turn what they were doing here into something real. Something profitable. Something legit. Broadside begins in 5. How'd he know the name Warhead? Riz asked out loud. 4. I swear, there was no data trail. Paprika paused. You think he was serious? 3. Nah. Carlos shook his head with confidence. He was just trying to scare us into joining his little cult. 2. Blip. Everyone's holographic armor suits, all the power-ups, and all the NFT guns on the lawn disappeared. The players looked around at each other, bewildered. What's happening? Asked Jason. KRUUUUNNNCH. The answer came from the driveway. The stealth dogjet uncloaked as it landed, flattening the brand-new red roadster. The aircraft doors opened, and the stealth units began to spill out. They swarmed into the backyard, cloaking and uncloaking erratically. The robots said nothing as they began firing. The Broadside teams on the lawn were closest, and the first to go down. Shards of heat tore into their bone suits, which were not designed to withstand real combat weapons. Players hit the floor, moaning in agony as the ad's rays convinced their nervous systems they were burning alive. Flashes of heat crisscrossed the lawn. Player after player hit the ground, screaming as white-hot pain consumed them. Those that could ran. The only player Paprika saw standing firm was Shiv. A stealth ran at them, uncloaking. Shiv didn't even blink. As soon as it was in range, Shiv stepped left and slugged it straight in the face with an overhand right. Paprika felt a flash of respect for Shiv, realizing they, all of them, were now on the same team. The robot turned its head on impact, eating the punch, and looked back at Shiv. One of its eyes welled with green fluid. It raised a hand and backhanded Shiv across the jaw, knocking them out cold. Carlos ran. Paprika followed him, looking back as Shiv crumpled to the ground. Paprika turned back just in time for a heat blast to hit them directly in the face. A brilliant pain consumed Paprika as they fell to the ground. Suddenly their helmet felt like a furnace. They writhed in agony, rolling into a bush as more heat blasts pocked the lawn around them. Paprika opened their visor, wailing and clawing at their face, unable to believe they weren't on fire. Their eyes streamed tears. Paprika tried to focus on their breath, detaching from the pain, the way Carlos had taught them to do in Broadside games. They breathed in and out deeply, blocking out all else. The pain began to subside. The world came back into focus. That was when Paprika saw the stealth holding Carlos. The robot picked Carlos up by the collar of his bone suit, holding him overhead. Carlos reacted instantly. He used his forward momentum to grab the robot's shoulders, wrap it in a leg lock and twist it 180 degrees. Paprika watched from under the bush as Carlos wrestled the robot down, slamming it into the ground. Paprika tried to get up, but their body wouldn't move. It felt like all the air had been knocked out of their lungs. The stealth grabbed Carlos's visor, prizing his helmet clean off. Carlos brought his knees up, pushing them into the stealth's chest and pulling himself around, pinning the robot. The robot lashed out, grabbing Carlos's armor chest plate. Carlos tried to wrench himself free. The stealth ripped his chest plate off completely, but lost Carlos in the process. He was away and running again before the stealth could get up. Paprika's breath deepened. Their strength was slowly coming back. They watched as Carlos ran, his armor torn, and his helmet gone. Paprika had never seen him look this scared. He was running towards the fence that bordered the neighboring garden. It was at that moment that something else came into Paprika's view. It was shorter than a stealth. They noticed that this soldier was more ferocious than the others, if that were possible. It moved differently, slicing through the battle with emotion, with an anger Paprika could feel. When it head-butted a younger Broadside player, Paprika knew for certain it was human. A sick, dangerous human that must be stopped. Paprika managed to put their weight on their hands, crouching like they were on the starting blocks. They lowered their visor, their strength returned, ready to attack the shadow. That was when Riz jumped on the shadow's back. The shadow spun and threw Riz, pounding her into a rock headfirst. Riz didn't get up. The shadow ran in Carlos's direction. Paprika sprang from cover, chasing after it. Michelle knew something was wrong as soon as she saw her brother calling. She was in the kitchen at her apartment in South City getting ready to hit a VRA meeting before work. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she answered. Cough? What's? They're everywhere. NNK. They're trying to kill us. The signal was patchy. Koth's voice was lost under what sounded like a riot. What? Koth? Slow do. You gotta come now. Bring as many as you can. What's happened? Now. The phone cut out. Michelle pulled up the last caller's location. Hillside Park? She grabbed her jacket and rushed out of the door. Paprika ran towards the shadow, who was running at Carlos, who was scrambling over the fence at the edge of the yard. Carlos dropped down onto the neighbor's lawn. Paprika was gaining on them. Ahead, the shadow smashed through the fence, burying Carlos under splinters. He struggled to his feet. The shadow stood over him, waiting until Carlos was upright, before punching him back down. Carlos hit the ground again. Blood poured from his nose. This time he didn't get up. Carlos! Paprika screamed. Carlos and the shadow turned as Paprika sprinted towards the hole in the fence, dodging heat blasts. Paprika locked eyes with the shadow, close enough to see eyes through its visor, to know for sure it was human. Paprika held its gaze without blinking, animal skull masking their identity. The shadow nodded back at Paprika as it turned, ready to fight. Which is exactly what Paprika had wanted. By the time the shadow looked back at Carlos, he was already close to the back door of the neighboring house. The shadow started after him, firing a barrage of heat. Michelle pounded down Hillside Boulevard towards the park in South City. She could hear the screaming crowd before the scene came into view. A marshal platoon had stormed the field where what looked like a Broadside game was taking place. But as far as Michelle knew, you couldn't just play Broadside in a park. Whatever they were doing, the battle was already over and the Broadsiders had lost. Battered players struggled as they were shoved into a line of waiting riot wagons. Others lay wailing, still in burning pain. The robots had formed a barrier between the throng of angry onlookers and the park's perimeter. The mob undulated as it pushed against the marshals. The robots shoved back, with their weapons primed. There were riots and the like in slums from time to time, but Michelle hadn't seen anything this bad in a while. She stopped running, gasping for air, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Why were they in the park? Was this anything to do with all the marshals and pan-ups sniffing around yesterday? She could have sworn Koth said he had a league game tonight. It was then that Michelle saw her younger brother, bucking and kicking as a marshal pushed him towards a riot wagon. The marshal fired. Koth cried out in pain, arching his back as the robot kicked him into the open truck. The crowd roared in anger. Michelle broke into a sprint. When it was about her, she tended to run away. But when someone was trying to hurt Koth, she ran straight at them. She stormed down the hill towards the park, muscles rippling as she picked up speed. Michelle had been skinny as a kid, and a skinnier junkie. But she'd spent her recovery years pouring her energy into a punishing fitness regime. All this training suddenly mattered immensely as she dived into the mob, clothes lining a marshal holding back the crowd. A battle cry went up as the mob followed Michelle's lead, piling into the breached marshal barrier. The robots answered immediately. Heat ripped into them. People fell. Projectiles flew back at the robots. Michelle ducked low and covered her head as she barreled into the storm of limbs and metal. Painful flashes of heat grazed her. But nothing would stop her from getting her brother out of that wagon. The cacophony around her grew louder. Wham! Paprika watched Carlos kick open the back door of the neighbor's house. He slammed the door shut behind him, trying to lock the shadow out. The doorframe split apart as the shadow tore in after him. Paprika ran faster. In South City, the enraged crowd swept Michelle along. The marshal she downed was getting trampled. Green slime erupted from its vents. Its blue LED eyes flickered to black. Michelle pushed towards the riot wagon where Koth was. A bottle smashed against the side of the vehicle. A heat blast glanced her shoulder. She winced at the pain. But she had to focus. The marshals that had been guarding the riot wagon's doors were lost in the brawl. Michelle saw her chance and muscled her way forward. Koth! She screamed as she swung the heavy doors of the riot wagon open. An avalanche of Broadsiders stampeded out, pushing her back. More riot wagons pulled up. Doors swished open and another cluster of marshals steamed into the fight. Michelle fought her way inside the truck. She saw her brother at the back, struggling to get out. She lunged forward and prized him from the fracas, shoving him through the doors back into the crowd. Michelle! Another voice yelled. She saw Koth's friend Omar from the bubble kitchen, trapped at the back of the truck, wrestling with a marshal. Michelle climbed towards Omar, grappling with the robot, trying to lock its arms up in a clench. The marshal jammed a sharp metal elbow into Michelle's jaw, sending her reeling. It snapped round to face her. The marshal twisted its fist into a glowing fireball. A bright pulse of heat slammed into Michelle's face, hurling her clean out of the riot wagon and onto the ground. An incandescent pain blinded her. She wheezed, nursing her stinging, bloodied jaw, trying to open her burning eyes, trying to get some air back into her burning lungs. She looked out through tears of pain at the shifting sea of legs and fists. Koth was gone. Paprika burst through the hole where the back door had been, into the kitchen. The shadow had Carlos pinned against the fridge, one hand closed around his throat, choking him. The body of a young man, who Paprika assumed was Jason's neighbor, lay unconscious on the kitchen floor. The meal he had been preparing was still bubbling in a vitro vat on the kitchen counter. Stop! Screamed Paprika. The shadow turned. It opened his visor. He was a man. Paprika noticed a word etched into his military-grade armor. Rook. Rook grinned, catching his breath. Paprika stood facing him in a combat stance, visor still down, skull helmet hiding their identity. Yeah? You want some too, you little runt? Rook smiled. In one movement, Paprika snatched the hot vitro vat from the counter and threw the contents into Rook's face. Irish. F F F F F F F F U U U U U U U U U U U U. Rook spluttered, stumbling. He clutched his face as boiling water and meat sludge scorched him, running down the inside of his helmet and armor. He tripped over the neighbor's comatose body and stacked it, hitting the floor, writhing in pain. Paprika grabbed Carlos. They barreled into the corridor, down the hall and out of the front door of the house. The crowd in South City thinned as people fell or fled, outnumbered by the marshal platoons. The wall of marshals squeezed the remaining Broadsiders back towards the riot wagons. Some raised their hands, giving up, and were stuffed into trucks. Those that resisted buckled under heat blasts. Michelle crawled to her knees, regaining her breath. She wasn't being taken in. She wasn't going to surrender. She had to find Koth. She roared, springing forward into the marshals once more. The robots around her acted in unison. 3 of them rushed her. Another aimed and fired. Rage took over her as she pushed back, dodging blasts. The marshals moved in tight around the door, forcing Michelle back into the overflowing riot wagon behind her. With her last ounce of strength, Michelle burst forward, rage and determination numbing the searing heat, trying to escape through the gap in the truck's thick doors as the marshals forced them shut. She stretched out her hand and jumped as the doors closed. Cold, heavy metal tore into her arm as the doors slammed, biting down on her shoulder with a crunch. This pain was new. It didn't seem real. She heard a loud screaming, coming from her own mouth, as the bloody truck doors yawn open again and she fell headfirst onto the ground. Michelle convulsed and shuddered. It felt like her torso had been split in two. Blood gushed from her shoulder. She knew it was as bad as it felt when the marshals stepped back. Silence fell in the truck as its captives watched Michelle's severed body squirm in the dirt. Move out, a marshal barked. The robot snapped back into action, slamming the truck's doors shut this time, muffling the cries of its occupants. Motors roared and the riot wagons disappeared in a dust cloud. The robots on foot spread outwards in a circle towards the remaining onlookers. They ordered them to disperse, heat guns charging, herding them back towards the surrounding streets and towers of the slums. Michelle lay whimpering, bleeding out on the battlefield next to the remains of the first marshal she took down. The crowds and the robots sounded distant. She was shivering. She noticed another sound, a rustling. She turned to see a dark figure slithering out from under a parked car. Koth! Koth crawled towards Michelle, looking down at his older sister's broken body in horror. He knelt beside her. Can you move? Michelle cried out as she tried. Despite the pain, she could. She sat up, looking at her bloody, mangled shoulder. She dry heaved at the sight, choking on her own breath, shaking. Koth took off his hoodie and wrapped it around the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. Michelle could see the panic on her brother's face that he was trying to hide. We gotta go, okay, he said, trembling. He hoisted Michelle's working arm over his shoulder. They moved, limping into the long shadows of the now deserted park. Paprika and Carlos ran out of the house into the street. 3 riot wagons loaded with marshals were rumbling towards them, sirens wailing. They ducked into cover behind a parked car. What now? Paprika asked Carlos. We stand and fight, Carlos said, sucking in air, getting his breath back. Or we try and outrun them. Neither option sounded good. Paprika remembered the D-Scent app. They opened it, and pinged Zero's number, dropping a pin at their location. Carlos jumped. He backed away from the house, towards the road, suddenly terrified again. Paprika turned. Rook was standing in the doorway. His face cut and bleeding. A furious swelling throbbed on one side where the vitro vat had burned him. He blinked through the meat sludge dried to his skin, leveling his arm cannon at Paprika. It hummed, getting louder as it charged. Carlos's expression changed. He didn't look scared anymore. "Run!" he shouted. Rook fired at Paprika. Paprika dived as the blast smashed into a parked car. Carlos sprung at Rook, slicing across the lawn, and launching into the air. Rook locked onto Carlos, firing a second thunderclap of heat. The blast threw Carlos back into a parked car. Rook fired again. The third blast sent Carlos barreling over the hood of the car, into the street. The next sound Paprika heard was skidding, and the wet splintering of bone. Paprika rolled over and stood to see the three riot wagons piled into each other. Steam hissed out from the front of one. A lifeless marshal was caught in a web of cracks in the windshield of another. And then Paprika saw Carlos. In front of the riot wagons, their brother lay face up, staring at the sky. His eyes were cold. Half of him was crushed under the riot wagon. Limbs twisted at angles that didn't make sense. Fingers of blood spread out from under him. Paprika began to shake, eyes welling. They limped towards Carlos, legs trembling, their body shivering. Paprika dropped to their knees in front of their brother, unable to process what was happening. No. No, Carlos. Carlos. No! Rook's bloody, burned face loomed over Paprika's shoulder. Yes, he whispered in Paprika's ear. Rook snatched Paprika up by the scruff of their neck and grabbed the seat of their pants. Rook spun Paprika around and rammed them face first into the windshield of a parked share car. Paprika plunged through the windscreen so hard the airbags in their armor and helmet inflated. They looked up at Rook through their helmet. Winded, covered in glass, trying to move. Rook leaned in. Stealths and marshals appeared around him, surrounding the car. Heat cannons trained on Paprika. Rook nodded, twisting his burnt, swollen face into a smile. Paprika blinked back at him through their helmet, terrified, inching away from him as he tried to grab hold of their arms. A sound rose behind them, rising too quickly for anyone to turn in time. Screech! Crump! The black SUV careened into Rook and the robots, smashing them out of the way like bowling pins. The back door of the SUV slid open. Zero looked down at Carlos's body, and then into the parked car at Paprika, covered in glass. He held out his hand. "Get in," he barked. He looked pale. Paprika mustered just enough energy to open the car door, falling out of the driver's side toward the SUV. Zero grabbed onto Paprika. From inside the SUV, another pair of familiar hands reached out too. Riz pulled Paprika inside. She was shaking as much as Paprika was. Her head was cut open. Tears began rolling down her cheeks. Paprika turned to see Shiv, Jason, and Taki in the back of the SUV, battered, bleeding and in shock, looking out in horror at Carlos' body. Two figures sat in the front with Zero, D-tag hoodies and bandages covering their faces. More riot wagons appeared in the distance. "Go!" shouted Zero. The SUV doors closed as Paprika collapsed into the seat. They felt their body go numb as the SUV sped away. Paprika heard the others sobbing and screaming, but the world was spinning, and Paprika could no longer tell who was making which sound. Paprika tried to say something but couldn't. Riz held Paprika in her arms, sobbing loudly. Her chest twitched against Paprika's face as tears fell from her eyes. Zero leaned back and grabbed Paprika's hand. "I'm sorry," he said gently. "I'm so sorry." Behind them sirens roared. The SUV accelerated. Paprika's eyes swam. The world blurred into shapes and colors, and suddenly felt like it was thousands of miles away. Paprika's head sunk into the seat as they blacked out.